Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I am Dr. Carlos Bosques. I'm the CEO at FOSSI, and it's an honor to welcome you to another great scientific discussion on our seminar series. At FOSSI, our focus is to understand, translate, and intervene with food allergies. And one key question driving our research is why people develop food allergies and why is there such a rapid increase in food allergies over the last few decades. In September, we introduced our new seminar series that we call Project Safe, which focus on in understanding the impact of chemicals in food and the environment and how is that impacting food allergies. So the series highlight the science of how the evolution of chemicals in the food system and the environment could have an impact on human health and especially help to explain the rapid increase in not only food allergies, but many chronic disorders that we have seen such an amazing increase over the last few decades. We hope you continue to join us for the monthly seminar series. We have three more speakers after today's discussion, and we will continue to highlight the critical science around this topic and learn from experts in the field like today. Today, it's a real honor to have Dr. Timothy Moran, who is an associate professor of pediatric allergy, immunology, and rheumatology at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. He's also a member of the Center for Environmental Medicine, Asthma, and Lung Biology. And Dr. Moran's research uh, focus on defining the key environmental adjuvants within indoor exposome that promotes allergic sensitization. In other words, understanding how environmental factors and environmental chemicals indoors and out inside our houses, how that can promote the allergies, the development of allergies. Um, he's very interested in understanding the mechanisms by which these environmental factors, like such as pollutants, can condition the lung to really initiate the cascade of allergic reactions. And so we are excited to have Tim with us here. Tim is a great friend of FOSSI, and he's doing an amazing work that we're all interested, especially around this field. And before I pass it on to Tim, I just want to remind people that we're going to be taking questions from our box at the end of his presentation. But with that, I will, Tim, I want to welcome you to FOSSI again. Great to have you again. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to learn, to talk to you, and to learn from you. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, Carlos, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Again, it's an honor to be here to talk about something that's very dear to my heart, which is trying to understand why allergies happen and the role that the environment may play in that. And so I am going to attempt to share my screen right now with you all. Okay, and let me just hide these. There they go. Excellent. Well, we've already done the introduction slides. So again, I appreciate everybody. But again, my name is Tim Moran. I'm a physician scientist at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And, I spend my time seeing both patients with allergy, particularly food allergy, as well as time in the lab trying to better understand why food allergies are happening. In terms of disclosures, just I do receive funding from the National Institutes of Health and as well as the Food Allergy Research and Education Organization. None of those would be relevant to the talk that I'm giving today, though. So my objectives for everyone today is first, we're going to give a review of how food allergy prevalence is increasing. As Carlos mentioned, that is something we've been seeing over the last several decades and trying to understand the data behind that and why that may be happening. We're then going to discuss about how exposure to environmental chemicals and pollutants may be promoting food sensitization and allergy development. I'm going to give you a sort of a big overview of some of the major categories we're interested in, talk a little bit about some of the epidemiology and science behind it, in a way that we hopefully is approachable for everyone that's on this call. And then at the end, I think it's important to sort of identify the outstanding research questions that are still out there. What are the key things that we need to know so that we can better treat food allergies, but also give our patients and their families better evidence-based strategies on how to minimize or mitigate the risk that environmental factors may play in promoting allergic sensitization. And so I think it's probably pretty obvious that I'm going to this slide right here, but there is just pretty good, strong evidence that environmental factors really are driving the food allergy epidemic. As many of us know, food allergies are common. They're potentially life-threatening. Over 32 million Americans have food allergies, and it is the leading cause of anaphylaxis in children, a serious, potentially life-threatening allergic reaction. And it's this fear of constantly being exposed to their food allergen that could result in a life-threatening reaction that really impairs the quality of life of patients and their families. The most common food allergens that we encounter in the United States include cow's milk, hen's egg, wheat, soy, peanut, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, and we're seeing more and more evidence of sesame. I'm starting to see more patients in my clinic that we're seeing this. And so, but of these, typically milk, egg, and peanut and tree nuts are going to be the ones we most often see in children. Now, there's strong evidence that food allergy prevalence has been increased in the United States as well as globally. If you look at the epidemiological data, US prevalence of food allergies have increased from 3.4% in the late 90s to 5.1% in the late 2000s. And those numbers have somewhat stabilized, but potentially are going up for certain foods. If you look at just specific foods, such as peanut allergy, we've seen, based on survey data, that rates in the US and Canada have tripled over the past 25 years. And hospitalization rates for food anaphylaxis in children have doubled between 2000 and 2009. Now, some people propose that maybe this is just we're better recognizing these, but I think the data there suggests that that alone can explain this. And genetics alone can explain this. While we know that genetic susceptibility is important for any allergic disease to develop, we have not undergone genetic drift or changes in our DNA in just a 20 to 30 year period. And this clearly indicates that there have to be some external factors in the environment that are contributing or driving this increase in food sensitization and food allergy that we're seeing. And so ultimately identifying these environmental factors is really going to be critical to understanding what is driving the food epidemic so that we can again develop better strategies and interventions for prevention and treatment of food allergy. So a key question that our lab is interested in that over the last several years become more and more intrigued with is this question is, do exposure to environmental chemicals and pollutants increase food allergy risk? Now, one thing that we've seen is that this increase in allergic disease prevalence is mirrored by an increase in exposure to chemicals in our daily lives. It's now estimated that we have over 350,000 new chemical exposures just over the past 6 decades. And while many of these, have been studied in terms of acute toxicity, we really don't know the issue, what they can have in terms of long-term chronic exposure, particularly at low levels. Some of the most common ones that we worry about are going to be synthetic chemicals, air pollutants, food additives, detergents, pesticides, as well as microplastics, which we're seeing more and more within the environment. These are ubiquitous in our modern lifestyle. The exposures to these happen all the time. And all of these agents at least have been shown to have some potential impact on the immune system. I think it's important to know that children in particular are going to be highly susceptible or vulnerable to these types of exposures. They have rapid respiratory rates. They have a larger surface body area. They're rolling around. They're putting things in their mouth all the time. And so it's really children that are going to be at highest risk of being potentially exposed to chemicals and other things within our home environment. And it's also become more and more clear that early life exposure to these probably has the most impact on shaping our immune responses to foods because that's when kids are starting to eat foods, in the first year or 2 years of life. And that's when the immune system is developing. And so when you start adding these environmental exposures at that same time, that's where problems potentially can develop and how our immune system responds to these. And so, what are some of the thoughts of how these could result in the induction of food allergy? Well, I think it's first just to give a real quick recap on what our normal immune system normally does when we encounter food, and that is to ignore the food. We use the term tolerance, meaning that when you eat the food, nothing happens. And tolerance, what happens here is in this depiction right here, you eat the food, it goes into your gut. The food is then taken up by these special cells that sample the environment. They're basically looking for things that might harm us or damage us. These are cells such as dendritic cells. What that cell will do, though, under normal circumstances in the gut, it'll take up that food, it'll go show it to another part of our immune system called the adaptive immune system, which includes cells called T cells that are really important in trying to figure out if something's harmful or not. And under normal circumstances, the body's going to tell us that, this food, it's not going to hurt us. This is food. We shouldn't react to it. And so that T cell will then get turned off. It potentially gets turned into a cell that will then inhibit future reactions against that, called a regulatory T cell. And this is what ultimately results in tolerance, meaning that we can eat that food and not have a problem. What happens when things break down here? Well, what can happen is when you're exposed to specific potential chemicals or pollutants, those can potentially set off false alarms or danger signals that can ultimately trick the immune system into reacting against something that it's not supposed to. And so what can happen here is, now when that food's being taken in, and if you're being also co-exposed at the same time to air pollutants, food additives, detergents, chemicals in the environment, microplastics, those can potentially damage this nice tight little epithelial barrier we have right here. So it allows more of these allergens to get into the body, maybe overwhelming the system. They can also trigger the release of danger signals, again, false alarm signals called alarmins, that tell the immune system, hey, this might be something dangerous. And again, inappropriately doing that. But this is, we're always on the lookout for things that could be potentially infectious for us. And so the body's now being alerted that maybe something dangerous is entering the body. And then a lot of these chemicals, too, have also been shown to potentially impact the activity of dendritic cells and T cells themselves. And ultimately, that is all things that can ultimately trick the body into developing this immune response against these agents and against food specifically, that result in the development of allergy. And this is when ultimately results in the production of these antibodies called IgE that mediate the allergies, so that when somebody gets exposed to that food in the future, they then start to have the classical symptoms of an allergic reaction, such as hives, swelling, vomiting, difficulty breathing, or a severe life-threatening reaction called anaphylaxis. So this is generally, again, an overview here, and we can, and there's obviously a lot more basic science to go into understand how these are, but I want to just give people an idea of how these things can potentially damage epithelial barriers, trick the immune system into reacting against things that it's not supposed to react against. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here just talking about some of the big categories here, and what would some of the data, epidemiological data, as well as some of the research that's been done to demonstrate how these exposures may be impacting food allergy development. And one thing I think you'll run into as a common theme is there's a lot to be learned. You're going to see a lot of me saying more research needs to be done, more research needs to be done. And I think that's, again, just highlights how we're kind of late to the game here in trying to understand how these environmental exposures are potentially impacting our immune system and potentially increasing our risk for food allergy. But late is better than never assessing this. So let's talk about pollutants. Unfortunately, about 90% of the world's population lives in an area with poor air quality, and this includes more than 135 million individuals in the United States. Some of the major components of air pollution include particulate matter. These are like little black specks that you can see floating around, as well as gases such as nitrogen dioxide. And the major source of these are going to be fossil fuel combustion. But we're also seeing wildfires being a potential source, particularly of particulate matter in parts of the country. And so there's a real concern about, as we see more and more wildfires occurring, how might this affect particulate matter levels, and is this and human health? When you look at birth cohort studies, there's overall been some mixed results, but in general, there is a signal showing that exposure to certain types of particulate matter can be associated with food sensitization around typically between ages 4 and 8 years of age. More recently, a birth cohort out of Australia was the first to show that exposure to PM 2.5 as well as nitrogen dioxide was associated with actually challenge-proven peanut allergy. So this is not just sensitization, but kids having real peanut allergy based on a food challenge. And there was a direct correlation between the exposure of PM 2.5 in the first few years of life with the prevalence of food allergy at 4 years. So this is pretty good evidence to suggest that being exposed to the particulate matter and certain air pollutants potentially can increase our risk of developing food allergy. Our lab in particular has used animal modeling to try to understand some of the mechanisms behind why this may be happening. And what we've shown is that in animal models, if you co-expose that mouse to peanut allergen with different particulate matter, that can activate the innate immune system, cause the induction of an allergic immune response that then results in the development of allergies in mice. And it's this co-exposure that seems to be really important. And so that's the leading theory that we have, is that when you get co-exposed to these environmental pollutants and food allergies during a particularly susceptible window of time, that ultimately can result in allergic sensitization. An area that I think we need a lot more work on is the effects of food additives and processing on food allergy. Now, food additives include substances that are added to foods for specific technical or functional purposes, and this can be done during the processing. They are often added to increase the storage or shelf life of foods, and as well as during the packaging right there. And some of these include things such as monosodium glutamate or MSG, polysorbates, lecithin, xanthan gum. These are emulsifiers that again extend the shelf life of a lot of these foods, a lot of artificial colorants as well. You find these frequently at very high levels in ultra processed foods, which is something that I think needs, again, a concern about how that may be affecting our overall health. Now, again, this is, labs are just starting to look at this, but there is some evidence out there that some of these chemicals and food additives may affect the immune system either directly or indirectly by altering the gut microbiome. And so studies out of Europe have shown that certain emulsifiers such as polysorbates can be toxic to human intestinal epithelial cells and trigger these inflammatory responses in them. Again, this is in a dish, a petri dish, but the concern is, could this be happening in our bodies as well? Certain products that get increased in foods when they get processed, such as advanced glycation end products, they can activate immune cells and disrupt the gut barrier. And then there's also been some epidemiological studies to suggest that consumption of ultra processed foods has been associated with changes in the microbiome. And we know that the microbiome, or the normal bacteria that live in our bodies, really plays an important role in regulating the immune system and our immune responses to foods. And so these are all concerns that exposure to these may be ultimately affecting it. But ultimately, we just need more mechanistic and epidemiologic studies so that we can give people, I don't want to fear monger. I want to make sure we're giving people information that's helpful for them, particularly my patients, but trying to understand, what of these, how these affect the immune system, and if there are ways that we might want to mitigate exposure to these, I think is very important. Another area that's interesting that over the last couple of years it's come up is the effect of detergents on food allergies. Now, detergents we think of, it's just soap, right? Well, there's a lot of synthetic detergents that have been introduced into our modern lifestyle since the World War II. And it's estimated that over 10,000 personal and home care products now contain synthetic detergents. And this is obviously things you would expect it in, like laundry detergent, dishwashing detergents. But we're also finding it in industrial cleaners, shampoos, and toothpaste. Uh, Detergents have been shown, not surprisingly, probably to disrupt epithelial barriers. Again, they're irritating, they can dissolve things. And by doing that, they may potentially now allow this nice tight barrier to now get leaky and allow allergens to come in more easily. There have been studies to show that laundry detergents, as well as rinse aids that we use in our dishwashers that restaurants use regularly, can be toxic to human gut cells at very low dilutions, like 1 to 20,000. And so just, having a little bit of residue on there could be potentially problematic. And then a colleague of mine, Ben Wright out at the Arizona Mayo Clinic, has shown that exposing mice to 0.5% SDS detergent, which is just 1/6 of the concentration found in toothpaste, for just 2 weeks resulted in allergic inflammation in the esophagus. And so these are preclinical studies. And we don't know yet, and there haven't been any large scale epidemiologic studies looking at the effect of detergents on food allergy. But I think this is an area that definitely needs to be investigated further. And what I've seen so far does have me a little concerned about how detergent exposures may be problematic. Another thing we talked about, and this is just big catch-all category of all the different environmental chemicals that we are exposed to. As I said before, there are literally hundreds of thousands that have been introduced into our modern lifestyle. And there's been a lot of talk about these over the years, but the data here is we just don't have a lot of strong data in terms of how important these are. So some recent studies have shown that pesticide exposure during the prenatal period was associated with a food allergy in a friend cohort study. Other molecules or chemicals that we find in a lot of cleaners or plasticizers that are within our homes, things that we call endocrine disrupting agents, such as bisphenols, phthalates, parabens, triclosan. Some of these have been shown to be associated when you look at epidemiological data, but again, showing causality here is still, no one's been able to do that yet. I think there's a lot of agents out there that we just don't know, and more work needs to be done. These include things such as organophosphate flame retardants, industrial dyes. That's something our lab has become interested in. A lot of these dyes that are in fast fashion, that are found in clothes, that easily shed off into the environment. We have some data that shows that some of these can stimulate immune responses in mice and sensitize mice to foods. And so that is an area that, again, that we think needs more work needs to be done in. And then also just, this concern about these forever chemicals such as PFAS and PFOS, how these may affect the immune system needs to be investigated as well. And ultimately, how chronic exposure to these chemicals affects the immune system is just poorly understood still. So in conclusion, I want to just make it clear that environmental exposures are likely driving the food allergy epidemic. Maybe they're not the sole thing, I'm not saying that, but they definitely are contributing factors. And again, just a lot of data to suggest this over the last few years. Things that I think we need more that could be potentially problematic includes things such as food additives, synthetic chemicals, and air pollutants. These all have the potential to damage epithelial barriers and ultimately trigger allergic inflammatory responses to foods. And ultimately, to date, and again, we've only just started to scratch the surface of how all these different chemicals may be affecting our immune systems and what role they may play in food allergy. And much more research needs to go into that. And I think that segues nicely into my next in terms of what are the future directions we need to focus on right here. We need more research to understand how these environmental chemicals and pollutants impact food allergy development. Key questions that I want to be able to answer so that I can give my patients useful information is, what are the key environmental drivers? How do environmental exposures alter the immune system responses to foods? And are there ways that we can actually rapidly screen chemicals or pollutants for pro-allergy potential to really identify the ones that we need to be most worried about? And then ultimately, we need this information so that I can give evidence-based strategies to my patients, to their families, on how to mitigate the risk of exposure to these. I think it can be overwhelming when I said 300, it's what can we do when there's hundreds of thousands of chemicals in the environment? That can be overwhelming. I totally get that. But I think if we can at least try to identify what are some common pathways that may be involved here, some general ways to potentially mitigate how these different categories of exposures may impact our immune system, that's where we're going to have the most success with, as well as trying to find things that we can do to combat that, to ultimately be able to do things to help create a more anti-allergy environment in our bodies as opposed to a pro-allergy environment. And I think this is going to be important for when we need policy recommendations as well, because we ultimately, we can't go and say change everything. A lot of our modern lifestyle is here to stay. And so we need to figure out what are some of the key things that maybe we need to focus on for overall better human health and to ultimately reduce the potential risk of developing food allergies in our population. And so with that, I thank everyone for their time. I'm going to go ahead and stop my sharing right here, Carlos. And my understanding is you have some finishing slides here, and then we can ask questions.
Yes, absolutely. No, Tim, thank you so much for that great conversation. It's really it's great to see all this information coming together as we try to help understand what's happening. Why are there so many people developing so many of these disorders, including food allergies? But people always ask me, how can they help? Donate. Host an event, follow us on social media, continue to join our seminars. There's a QR code here on this slide so that people can connect easily. We are a nonprofit organization, so we depend on your engagement. And so we have our next seminar presentation is going to be by Wolfgang Littner from the NIH, and that would be on Tuesday, April 15 at 12 p.m. And so with that, I will like to ask you a few questions and take any questions from the audience. So, Tim, Santan gum. I rarely now, it's always a joke for me because rarely do I find something that doesn't have xanthan gum or carrageenan gum. These are fillers that are put into, especially when you have any proteins and powders. They're typically found. You can look at the labels, and they will have xanthan gum and carrageenan gum. What have you seen and what have you learned? What is known about their impact in sensitization?
Yeah, unfortunately, not much is there. We understand these as being potentially fillers, some emulsifying properties right there. And so all we can kind of do is, sort of equate to what other people have looked at. And so as I talked before, some of these polysorbates, which also can act as emulsifiers in the body, there have been studies to show that they can be toxic to human gut cells and also potentially stimulate these inflammatory signaling pathways. So ultimately, the concern would be, can those potentially also be problematic within our guts? I think with anything, it's ultimately going to come down to the dose. And as a toxicologist, or that I as well, ultimately the dose of the medicine determines whether it's toxic or not. And so, low levels, maybe that's going to be not a problem. But when you start having it in so many different foods, and we're seeing it so often right there, and you start to then see this chronic exposure, my concerns are, what is that doing to the immune system? And I think, unfortunately, this comes back to something you're probably going to hear from me a lot, is we just need more research, and we need people to particularly focus on these things. And I think what's happened is that this maybe hasn't been as an exciting area for people to want to ask, but it's interesting because it's the most common questions about how these things affect us that we get asked. And so I think there's a discrepancy there, and why we need more focus on trying to understand the science behind this.
Excellent. No, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. For all those that drink a lot of the protein powders, I think one
Yeah.
of the major components is xanthan gum. I have another great question here
Hmm.
from Vena. Why in a family with children grown in the same household, only one child developed a food allergy, right? Versus
Yeah.
not the other, when typically that would assume that they have similar exposure to things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question too. And I think this is where, not all environments are the same, even if you're living in the same environment. But I think this is also where the genetics comes into play here too. So remember, for a food allergy to develop, environment alone is not going to be enough. Genetics alone is not going to be enough. You have to have that combination right there. And so there is, so definitely when, our children in general are going to have slightly different genes, that could potentially affect how we respond to these. I also think too that there's other cofactors that can come along here at the same time, and it may be also how we've maybe when we introduce foods to those children. If for some child you waited longer, we know that that potentially is a risk factor to developing food allergy. And so I see more and more families I counsel now and trying to get these foods in earlier, and that's been shown that their subsequent children a lot of times do not develop food allergies when we can get those in. So I think it's sort of a timing issue right there. I definitely think genetics play a role right there as well. But what I'd love to do, and this is what we've been wanting to do, is to be able to sample the environment with these homes and see how that may change over time. Like maybe we were seeing different chemicals in the home when the first child was born versus the second, or vice versa, right there. So that's where we need more studies in terms of being able to do, this exposome, we call that, being able to measure the exposome, understand what chemicals are in the environment and how those may change over time.
Excellent, excellent. I have many questions here, many interesting questions. I'll probably just do one more in the interest of time. But Sophie asks here, do you also look at endogenous food chemicals that are and their role in sensitization? For example, proteins in edible plants that are that have evolved in the defense systems of a plant, for example.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, plants are fascinating because they have these, like, these immune functional proteins that are good at protecting themselves. We have not specifically looked at that. We have looked at enzymes created that have protease activity. And so those would be things such as from molds, but we also find those in certain bacteria, as well as, allergens like house dust mite and cockroach. And so we have shown that when you get exposed, and the other thing, proteases, you find a lot more of those in our synthetic cleaning supplies. Like a lot of them have proteases now that help degrade the the dirt and grime and that's why our detergents work so well nowadays. We have shown that when you get exposed to peanut and a protease in mice, that definitely it tricks the immune system into responding to that peanut, and those mice develop peanut right there. Now, again, we're using high levels of the protease, and so trying to see, under more normal circumstances, is this a possibility is important. One thing we're interested in doing is, and we're collected house dust samples to do that, is to look at overall protease activity within house dust samples and see if there might be some correlation there with the development of risk for that. But in terms of other endogenous, antimicrobial products or proteins in foods themselves, we have not done that, but I think it's a fascinating question.
Excellent. Well, Tim, I have many questions here. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer all the questions, but for people in the Q&A box, please send me the questions. We'll be happy to try to address them offline. Tim, I want to thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Always great connecting with you, and thank you for a great discussion.
Excellent. Carlos, thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity and happy to answer whatever questions I can.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.